Let's open the tool. I'll just dock it anywhere, and we now have our volume in the scene. This defines where objects are going to be spawned. You can adjust it directly inside the viewport, or you can adjust it in the inspector itself. Position and scale. If we get lost in big scenes, you can also locate the spawn volume by pressing this button. There's a couple of other useful options like hiding the volume, and we can shade it if you prefer. Let's add some objects to spawn. I'll just select some rocks and a random table and maybe some vegetation as well. I'll drag and drop them into the prefab area. If I press spawn, I should see something. There we go. It's not very useful right now, but we have a lot of parameters we can use to tweak it, so I'll just delete the spawned prefabs. Before we begin, I'm going to toggle random seed. This just means that every time I click on spawn, it's going to use a random seed to basically randomize the placement of the objects. Also very handy is the poisson radius, which defines the distance between spawn points. So if I use an extremely high value, it spawns less objects because there's going to be more empty space between them. If I use a small value, let's go back to 2, and I spawn again, you'll notice that they are more tightly packed. We also have rejection samples. If I set it to something like 4, it becomes quite dense. But if I set it to something like 1, you can immediately see the difference. But if I go to something higher, like the default 30, here we get something like this. Play around and see what works best for your scenes. If I press spawn, I'm just going to create objects in the root of my scene, which is not ideal, but if I create a new game object and add it to the spawn parent slot, now all the objects will spawn inside. So there's a lot of ways to control where your objects are going to spawn. One of the most useful is the slope angle range. What this means is anything above a certain range will not spawn. So this one is 45 degrees, so anything below 45 degrees will not spawn any objects. As you can see, we've excluded the 45-degree slope. But this one, for example, it's 25 degrees. So if I increase my slope range to anything above 25 degrees, I'm going to spawn objects here. Let me just delete the previous and spawn. But as you see here, we're still excluding the 45 degrees because we've not reached that range. This comes into play in more complex scenes where you have multiple slopes, and it's a great way to avoid spawning objects on them or just to randomize things. Also, another interesting way to use this, since I can set my minimum to something above 0, that means that I'll exclude any flat surfaces. Very handy. And I could even say, for example, that I want to spawn above 45 degrees, and it spawns on anything above 45 degrees. Let me just delete that and set things back to normal. Another useful parameter is the scale range. Basically means it's a random between a minimum and maximum size of the spawn objects. Right now, they're all spawning at their default prefab size of 1 to 2.9. I want to change that, so I'm going to set the minimum to 2 and a maximum of something like 5. When I spawn now, I'm going to get huge objects, which is not ideal in this case, but it's just an example. Let me set this to something more useful, maybe between 2.6 and 1, so when I spawn I can see the difference. Let's delete this and talk a little bit about align normal. This basically means that when your object spawns, it's going to try to align to the normal surface. You can disable this if you want to, if it makes sense for your scene. You'll just spawn as they are originally oriented, so pretty much upright. Let's delete these and turn it back on. This is useful, but we can do much more. We can add tilt variation to any of the listed objects. Basically, you set a minimum and a maximum, and the scatter tool is going to rotate that object. Let's test it. Not too obvious with these objects, so let's change them. I'll clear the prefab list. And I have a couple of objects here which are great for this type of test. I'll just drag them in and let's do a test without variation. If we spawn now, we get fully upright pillars. But now I want to align them to the surface. And also let's exclude the flat surfaces to make it easier to see. So now every object is perpendicular to their surface. This looks a bit artificial, and this is where the tilt variation comes in. We set a minimum and a max rotation value, and it's going to be randomized. So this is a bit extreme. If I spawn now, everything's going to rotate around and it looks kind of off. But if you use low values, which I personally like, something between 0 degrees and maybe 15, it's going to start adding variation to your objects, and it looks a little bit more natural. There's also the variation threshold. And for that, let me just go a little bit back and spawn on flat surfaces as well. I'm also going to reduce the size a little bit because these objects are a little bit bigger. Let's do another interesting test here. So I'll set my variation to something higher just to see. Okay, they're all rotated, and now I'm going to add tilt variation threshold. This means that every object that spawns on a flat surface is going to be fully straight without any tilt variation. So as you can see, all objects on flat faces are perpendicular to the floor, while the objects on the slopes are slightly varied using our tilt variation. This can be quite handy if you need upright objects on one side and tilted objects on another. Let's remove the prefabs and say that I just want tilted objects on our 25-degree slope, but not on my 45. It's easy. I'm just going to drop this. There we go. And now if I spawn anything above 25 degrees, it's not going to show variation. It's a simple way to exclude surfaces, but extremely handy in more complex scenes. Keep in mind that this also works for terrains. Let's delete these and also replace our prefabs. I'll use the table as an example. They are quite small. And the last setting that we have is random rotation. So basically right now it's applying a random rotation from 0 to 360 degrees, and we can totally control that. If we disable it, they're all going to be aligned the same way in y-axis. And we can also set a minimum and max, and everything is going to be rotated. But for most cases, you're probably going to want to keep the defaults unless you have something really specific that you want to rotate. You can leave these as their default. There's a couple of other options, like the avoid overlap, which can be useful if you don't want to have any overlapping spawned objects. I should say that this is not perfect, it attempts to not overlap, but it's not 100% accurate. As you can see, the tilt variation is not ideal for this type of object, so you probably want to disable this. Now we have a much better distribution of these tables. Let's say I don't want to have any objects there. I'll just go to my inspector and change the default layer. Let's use Ignore Raycast. And back into the Scatter tool, I'll just delete the prefabs. And here I want to exclude Ignore Raycast. So when I spawn now, regardless of my parameters here, it's not going to spawn any objects on it. And that's pretty much it. That's all you need to know to spawn objects. The Amplify Scatter tool is free at the Unity Asset Store. Check it out in the links below. Thanks for watching.